Heads and drinking water supply status update report, and I'd like to hand over to John Mackey to commence with just a brief overview of the situation that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, well, thank you. It'll come as no surprise to you the events of Havelock North in August 2016, and in response to that, the whole industry has been looking very, very closely at the security of their water supplies across the country. So there was an inquiry established, and they had two reports. Stage 1 report from the Havelock North inquiry came out in May 2017, and we were very interested in those results, and that leveled some criticism of a lot of parties involved in the security of and the health of drinking water. From the Stage 1 report, we then took a very, very close look at the regime of looking at these wellheads, looking at our water security, our compliance with the drinking water standards with quite some rigour. And we called one of our technical people, made the inquiries of our contractors to say, look, what's the regime? We want to make sure that we are still fully compliant with all of the stuff that was in the Stage 1 report, which really related just to Havelock North. They hadn't addressed the rest of the country, the implications for the rest of the country, which was coming in Stage 2. The contractors came back and said, well, when we look at them in the light of what we've seen in the Stage 1 report, there are some things that we could be doing to improve them. So we got them to do an assessment of all of the wells around the city. They routinely go and inspect and maintain and check the pumps and check everything's working. But again, this is just a routine operational thing that they've been doing for probably over a decade or more. But we were looking at it through a new lens. And they came back with a whole bunch of recommendations that some of those cable entry ducts aren't as tight as they could have been. There's a couple of cracks in the concrete. There's water getting onto the floor of some of these things. So we said, like, guys, not good enough. You need to be putting in a program to improve all of those aspects. That's what they did. So they came back with a proposal to do a whole range of work on 103 boreheads, and we put that in play. And we had some costings at that point, about $800,000, $200K in the current year, with the other 600 in the following year. And that program started in July, August last year. And we've been monitoring progress, and City Care have been giving me weekly update reports because that's how seriously I was taking this issue. Fast forward to December the 6th, when the Stage 2 report came out, and there was some 51 recommendations in that Stage 2 report, and amongst the key ones for us was that they said they were recommending that we should no longer have reliance on secure status of wellheads to meet the drinking water compliance. They had strong recommendations for mandatory water treatment and chlorination.
Yeah, but none of those have been accepted by the government.
None of those are accepted by the government. So
the real focus is the Ministry of Health,
yes,
and
so,
what that led
and
to.
In one of those recommendations was that the Director General of Health use the powers under the existing legislation to get better compliance with drinking water standards across the country. The Director General of Health then sent a statement on the 20th of December bringing that to the attention of all water suppliers, that they should not rely on secure well status. They should consider treatment until any recommendations had been agreed by the government. We were considering that, and we were preparing a paper for council after that event. In the meantime, technical staff had been going through their normal program of doing the independent engineering assessment of wellheads to confirm compliance with the drinking water standards. So the consulting engineers, in the light of these reports that were very critical on one of their peers, a consulting firm, they are taking much more rigour in their assessment of the wellheads, and they were reluctant to sign off on the wellheads. So this was on around the 15th, 16th of December, the draft report that not even I had seen at that stage. But they were having discussions with the drinking water assessor about what that meant. I arranged to meet with the Medical Officer of Health and the Drinking Water Assessor on the morning of the 22nd of December. And it was at that meeting, Alistair was on leave, Ramon Pink was the Medical Officer of Health at the time. We said, look, the consequence of the Director General's letter and the reluctance of the professional engineers to sign off on the wells meant that that could imply that we no longer meet the secure status, which was one of the 3 criteria for meeting the drinking water standards. And that's when we put the paper to council. I wrote a paper, finished it that day, and sent it off to my general manager, copied in the legal people, CEO, and suggested that this needs to be addressed. With that time, we were going into the Christmas period. I was planning to work through anyway because there was still a lot of work to do. At the same time, we were reviewing our water safety plan. And the water safety plan is a critical a critical document, because the water safety plan is what gives assurance to the drinking water assessor that we are compliant with the drinking water standards. And that's the means of which compliance is agreed. And so during the break, we reviewed the water safety plan. I reviewed the business continuity plan. We got a whole lot of things up and running. I was getting weekly reports from CityCare, who gave me progress reports every Friday afternoon. And to date, they've completed 7 of the whole program. Those 7, of course, are the most critical ones that we have in the city, and they're now completed. I'll hand over, so that's just a quick background to where we are, and I'll hand over to...
Can I just to emphasise just that period of time when you had asked CityCare to undertake a review of the wellhead status, you were in conversation with the medical officer of health and the drinking water assessor right throughout that period, so that's July, August.
That's correct. So one of the first initiatives, such a serious issue, we engaged with the medical officer of health and the drinking water assessor. In fact, we did a site visit, I think, early October, to look at some of the work. And also the Drinking Water Reference Group, which is the group that we set up in response to Havelock North, which is all of the 5 local councils, the CDHB, ECAN, and we share our knowledge and share experiences and share information. So that was one of the things that was highlighted in the Havelock North report. That's not an issue for Canterbury.
So the obligations under the drinking water standards, the 3 that we've highlighted in the report there, in terms of relying on secure bore water status, that is an ongoing obligation. It's not something that you have to comply with once a year and tick boxes. It is a total 365 days a year obligation, and if there are transgressions you have to report them, and if there are breaches to the bore heads as picked up by an ongoing assessment, then they have to be reported.
That's correct. So every year we do a report to the drinking water assessor on the compliance with the drinking water standards to the year ending June. This last year it was forwarded in July and was reviewed, and we got the feedback in August saying that everything was honky-dory at that point. We still had secure status, and in fact, and they were complimentary of the response that we'd taken to date on the drinking water inquiry.
So and that statement about the response to the drinking water inquiry, that was actually repeated in the letter of the 22nd of December last year.
Yes, that's correct. So we've had a good, strong working relationship all the way through. It's important to note that the quality of the drinking water has not changed, and so it still is as good as it ever was. We manage that risk, we test it, we do more testing, bacteriological testing than we need to under the drinking water standards at the time. To give ourselves that assurance, because I'm well aware, as I reported in September 2016, that we have this residual risk in Christchurch where we do not treat the water. And that's the risk between the time we take a test and the time we get the results, which is 24 hours later. There is that 24-hour gap where if there was a contamination event, I wouldn't know about it. And that's my biggest concern, and that's why we actually have a very rigorous regime of water testing.
But in July, August, when you're talking to the drinking water assessor, the program of action that you've decided to take through CityCare is sufficient to meet the ongoing obligation under Criterion 2.
That's correct. So that was an agreed
But
position.
that changed in December
Correct.
2017.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Alistair.
mate, can I hand to the Medical Officer of Health, Alistair Humphrey, to get the public health background on this.
Okay, good morning everybody, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. The first thing I want to say is that we, in Christchurch, we're very proud of our water. We love our water. We know the difference between our water and everyone else's in the world, because we occasionally get the opportunity to compare them. But from my perspective as a public health physician, I am also satisfied, and have been satisfied for the 18 years or so I've lived here, that Christchurch City Council as a supplier goes above and beyond what it needs to do to keep our water safe, notwithstanding that most of the time it doesn't treat the water. Christchurch City Council has always been responsible about keeping the community safe from problems with its drinking water. Following the earthquake, very promptly the council took the decision to chlorinate the water. It was a temporary measure. It was vital that it was done, and they did it. The Christchurch community also participated in keeping themselves safe at that point. We remarkably had no gastro outbreaks following the earthquake. That is very unusual. So you, as the council and the council staff, have been mindful of the safety of the water for as long as I can remember. And the first thing I will say about this is our routine responses as a community are what we are dealing with here. We are not responding to the Havelock North inquiry. That is very important to understand. We have in place a safe regime that has been there for a very long time. We comply with the drinking water standards. Drinking water assessors and I oversee that, and Christchurch has complied with the drinking water standards throughout. It is a routine process that the borehead security is assessed, and that's laid out in the paper you've got. The boreheads are assessed in a rolling program once every 5 years, a fifth every year. And that is what has determined the change here. The independently commissioned engineers have come back and said that though they gave provisional status for a number of years, they could no longer give that provisional status, and that was their decision. As soon as they had made that decision, we were in a situation where we were being told, in effect, that there was no barriers to contamination for our drinking water. And as a community and as a supplier, the council have to respond to that. It's commendable that the council, in fact, had already responded even before they got that, and that's the work that John Mackey has already spoken about. There already was in place a program to seal in those boreheads, and also, as it happens, to deal with the reservoirs, which were the only places where we had had significant transgressions in the past. So we have a water supply where there have been no transgressions, as far as I'm aware, except a few in the reservoirs where there were cracks. Part of the program was to deal with that as well. So the point here is that the staff at the City Council, the council as a supplier, have been ahead of the game all the time. They were still ahead of the game, but the engineers told us in December that we no longer had secure status. Secure status, just to remind you, is dependent on three things. One, there should be no transgressions. There have been no transgressions. Two, the water should be aged appropriately, so old water is safe water. A model was used to calculate the age of Christchurch's water, and it is indeed old water, therefore safe. The third criterion was where we failed, and as John has outlined to you, there were potential leaks in the system at the wellheads. Those have to be dealt with to make the water safe. So, following that report, we are in a situation where, sensibly, we should expedite that process if we can, the program that's already been put in place. But in order to meet your obligations under the drinking water standards, it is important that there is another barrier to contamination for the community of Christchurch. We have more than 300,000 people effectively now relying on a water supply with no barriers. And I always have considered the rigour with which Christchurch monitors the water and invests in its reticulation system to be a barrier in itself. The secure status of the groundwater is also another barrier. As far as I'm concerned as a professional, that is a multi-barrier approach. Some people will say you should always chlorinate. I think Christchurch is a special case. We don't need to always chlorinate. We have a special set of circumstances at the moment, which means in order to keep our community safe, as the City Council has always chosen to do in the past, we need to chlorinate the water. So I support your Chief Engineer's recommendations, John Mackey's recommendations, that the water should be temporarily chlorinated until such time as the independent engineering company sign off secure status for our groundwater, and then we can go back to enjoying the water that we've enjoyed for many decades. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, questions, Aaron?
Yeah, thank you for that explanation from both of you. It is very, very clear. The question that came to me through members of the public, and I do agree with them, is if there's a potential risk to our water and our water supply, because this chlorination process will take time to implement. It's not a switch that'll be flicked on today, no doubt. If there is a danger or a risk, why is a boil water notice not issued straight away?
A boil water notice is not required. There is no imminent risk to the community. We have not had transgressions. If we had transgressions, that would be different. We would definitely be issuing a boil water notice. But there is no imminent risk. This is about dealing with the long-term risk and making sure that the supply in the long term is a safe supply. So a boil water notice, in my view, is not necessary in the interim period. What is important is that the council gets on with the work expeditiously.
But as our council knows well, disasters don't tend to stick to timelines. So if we got an outbreak, it could be today or tomorrow, or in 3 months' time once we've got the chlorination process in place. So that's what I think some people are struggling with, including myself.
Yeah, as I say, we're dealing with an imminent risk. The probability is extremely low, the consequences may be high, but in the meantime, we have a system set up that has been identified by the engineer as a shortcoming in one area. It hasn't changed anything. That has been the same for a while. They have come back to us and said, these are issues you have to deal with. In my view, there is not an imminent risk to the population. We have not seen for decades, our water has been safe. There's no change in that, but this is a process to keep our water safe in a kind of medium to long term. It's not about, once those wellheads are sealed in, we'll be back to a safe situation, but chlorinating over a period of months is a way of dealing with that risk over a period of months. There's not a kind of day-to-day risk here that requires a boil water notice.
Yanni?
Yeah, I just wanted to check on the process. You just want questions to the Medical Officer of Health, or are you...
No, it's staff.
Okay, so let's put through questions as well. Is staff going to address those questions that we've put in like last night when we got the report? What's the process around that?
We're in the process of addressing those, but some of the questions are quite detailed and will take some time to answer.
Right, so should I ask those questions now again, or...?
Yeah, okay, yep.
Oh, okay.
I've got you, Pauline, Phil, Sarah, Dion.
Thank you.
But they have to be relevant to the paper.
It is relevant. So in regards to the issue of consultation with tangata whenua and the cultural perspective around putting chlorine into our water, what view or advice have we received in that regard? And do we have an obligation to engage with Māori over this decision?
If I could, I had talked to Gabrielle, our advisor, yesterday, and of course, similar to the Medical Officer of Health, their first priority is for the health of their people. And so they fully support if it's the opinion of the health authorities that we have to chlorinate the water, then that it must be. But they're of the same view to restore it to its previous condition. So that's the early advice we have on that.
The second question was, I was just trying to understand, obviously nothing's changed in terms of from last year to this, well, the previous year and the year before that, in terms of the bore heads, but they were signed off one year, they're not signed off the next year. So just trying to understand with the earthquake, we must have had a program to assess the different wellheads. What did that show, and had any of the wellheads been picked up through the 5-year audit or through the earthquake repairs and were on a program to get fixed, or were they still being signed off as okay?
So after each of the 4 big earthquakes, all of the wellheads were assessed again, and drilling contractors went round and then did the repairs over a period of time. That's all finished. So the issues we're dealing with now aren't earthquake issues. What's changed is the standard that the engineers expect when they're doing the wellhead security assessments.
So the standards changed because of the Havelock findings, which haven't come into law yet.
No. I don't think that the standard has changed. Is that the right word, or is it that their measure of assessment of compliance changed, and it's actually much more sensitive and rigorous, perhaps, in relation to their obligations to sign off on secure status?
Yeah, correct.
But isn't it pretty clear from the report that, I mean, if surface water can get in, then that's not acceptable. So how can we have 1 year have that being identified as a possibility, and next year and that year it's signed off, and next year it's still the same, but it's not signed off? Surely that's a kind of black and white measure if something's secure.
So that's about the risk aversion of the professional companies that have to rely. When you read the criticism of the engineering company that assessed the Havelock North wells, and none of them want to put that risk onto their professional indemnity insurance.
But to turn Yanni's question around, it may well be that the quality of the assessment that was done in previous years was not of a high enough standard for the protection that we require for our water supply.
Yeah, what was deemed acceptable in the previous...
But it's not what was deemed acceptable to them. They may not have met a sufficient standard to provide real protection to our water supply in relation to the obligations under the drinking water standards. So I'm not letting the previous engineers off the hook by a glib statement that the standard has changed just because of the Havelock North inquiry. I don't think that's you can make that assessment now. I think we do have to look at the quality of the work that was being undertaken before, because remember, Havelock North, what the cause was exactly that.
So the line in the report, in the 3.1 in the City Care Water Report, section 4.5.32, bore water security criterion 2, the borehead must be sealed at the surface to prevent the egress of surface water. So it's pretty black and white. It's not sort of, and what I can't understand is if we've had all the assessment post-earthquake and all these independent engineers looking at these things, signing them off when we've got water egress, how has that been allowed to happen?
That is the question that all of these companies that are doing these regulatory inspections are now aware of. And that's why we're seeing a lot more rigour in their assessments. And it's quite right, the standard to which they were applying to their assessments of the security of the wellheads may not have been, well, was not up to scratch, obviously.
So is there a sort of independent inquiry? I mean, can we have a recommendation to actually go back and look?
Well, there was an inquiry, so that was the Havelock North inquiry, and that's...
Well, no, I'm talking about into our own situation.
Yanni, can we deal with that separately? We're asking for matters to go back to the Infrastructure, Transport and Environment Committee, and I would like them to consider the update and the monthly progress report, and if they feel that it is appropriate to review that, which is something I favour myself, but it is something that I would rather deal with separately from this. And if you want to add some wording to number 4, then I'm quite happy that review the process for reporting on it. But to have the draft water safety plan now before the Infrastructure, Transport and Environment Committee for approval when completed adds the layer of governance which I think has been missing.
I do think it needs to come in front of the full council, and also I had another question in regards to audit and risk, and I know we've got a PX section on the agenda today. Would you prefer that I ask those questions in the public or in the PX section?
What?
If we don't know the question.
So,
no item on the agenda for audit and risk today?
No, we've got a PX section on our agenda around the legal advice in relation to this report. Do you want questions around PX audit and risk reports previously that identified water quality now, or do you want that in the PX section?
If it's a P,
Yeah,
if it's PX.
yeah. Because I have no idea what you want to ask, it's really hard to give you guidance in that
What I really
regard.
want to understand is, given that we've got an audit and risk committee, and given that this would have been one of the huge risks identified as in terms of a variety of mechanisms, you know, contract management, performance monitoring, assessment of infrastructure, and drinking water quality, I just simply want to understand what process we have in place to make sure that, you know, the operational aspects of what council's doing here are aligned or aligned with the audit and risk program, because when I read through that, there's a misalignment.
Well, yeah.
Audit and risk will deal with that in audit and risk.
Yeah, there will be a follow-up with audit and risk, absolutely. But I'm quite happy to work on some wording around this, and given that I just wonder whether that there will that should stop being a noting provision and just ask staff to report to the infrastructure, and we'll find some wording around a review of the past inspection regime, and we'll have that report back to the council, if that's all right, Pauline. Yeah, cool. So who was next? Pauline.
Thank you. A question for John. Now you mentioned that the Director General of Health stated that we should not rely on secure well status. Can you expand on that in the light of if we were to, or when we get our wells up to standard? What does that comment mean?
Right, so that was one of the 51 recommendations from the inquiry back to government. So that's in anticipation of what the Crown might do. We have no idea what the government might do with that recommendation. But in the meantime, he was asked to use the existing regulatory powers and bring those to the attention of drinking water suppliers. That was all.
So there could be some.
There could be more to come.
That if we do this work, which we want to do anyway, and it still may not be enough for us.
Depending on what the Crown decides to do with the recommendations from the inquiry, yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
But I would also draw your attention to another item in our report, which is a matter that we left on the table, lying on the table, which was a recommendation from one of the committees saying that we oppose the permanent, you know, direction for permanent chlorination, and in actual fact, maybe we need to find some words that incorporate our desire to see this as a mechanism by which we can, but ensure that remains the position with central government as well. Alistair.
Can I just make a comment on that statement from the Director General? Christchurch has never relied just on secure status. There's a lot of investment that the council and with the mandate from the community, has put into an effective additional barrier, we go above and beyond all the monitoring requirements, backflow monitors, maintenance of the reticulation system, that in effect, some may say is a better barrier than treatment, because actually it prevents all sorts of different infections or contamination of your water, not just bacterial and viral. So it's important to look at that in the right kind of context, and it's still important to remember that this is not about what the Director General says, this is not about the Havelock inquiry, this is about our routine processes. We have always been safe, and we have always, in effect, had a multi-barrier approach, even though we might not have used disinfection in our water.
Yeah. But I think that the point that councillors are, sort of grappling with at the moment is that clearly what has happened in terms of that secure status has been influenced by both of those factors.
Yes.
Right, I've got Phil, Sarah, Dion, and...
So my question really is in relation to the complexity of all of this too, and like we have a recommendation in relation to informing the community around these decisions, and that we would do that in conjunction with the Medical Officer of Health and informing the community. But I'm just wondering, given how complex this is, should we as a council not also be considering how in fact we go wider around the drinking water as one part of Christchurch's water issues? And is there perhaps potential that the government, central government, might also work with us so that in fact people understand what actually is happening, especially in connection to drinking water safety? So what I would like to see is that in fact maybe as a council we should go wider than just talking about informing people, but in fact we should have a whole education program so that there's better understanding.
Yeah.
I have been following social media, and some of the comments have been quite interesting and would indicate a lack of knowledge about some things, including the fact that there is no treatment applied to water that's bottled, because of course there is, but it's UV treatment. But we're not talking about a permanent solution here, we're talking about a temporary solution. And I think in the longer term, if we're looking at getting back to, well, in the short term, getting back to, or the medium term, getting back to secure status, then we will be relying on the multi-barrier approach that we've always had as a city. So, but I think it would be useful, and I agree with you. I think that we need a very wide media campaign, and listening to the public participation that we had just before. We cannot just rely on social media, so we're going to have to, I think, buy some advertising with very clear messages. But the challenge for everyone is that the risk is no greater than it was. The risk has not changed. The risk is slight. The risk is small. But the consequences of anything going wrong are huge. And that's the difference. And that's what risk is. It's probability and consequences. When you've got low probability and high consequences, you tend to think around the probability, shall we take the risk? We did that when we considered the shallow bores in the northwest. Are we prepared to take that risk for the whole city? That's the question.
And just to further than that, in anticipation of the release of the Stage 2 report, we did work with our communications people and started preparing a communications plan ahead of the report landing. And in that, there was a whole range of community education, advice, even an advertising schedule for whatever the outcome might have been. So there is that work that's already been done.
Thank you. And thank you, Alistair. Your approach has been incredibly helpful and clear throughout this. I'm just wondering if you've been really complimentary about the processes that we have as an extra barrier, so the actual management of the system itself. And I'm wondering if our mitigation might have an option that isn't chlorination, that would satisfy you through management. So it's very clear that the likelihood, slim as it is, comes when there's rain events and there's potential surface water egress into the wellheads. If we were able to have a management system which had contractors or staff on site during rain events checking for water, if there was any sign of water entering any of the wellheads, that particular wellhead was switched off until it could be cleaned, would that satisfy you as to the safety of our water supply without having to go through the full preemptive chlorination of our entire city supply?
The question, it really seems to me to be rather a technical one, but the first point I'd make is that there are 103 wells dotted through the city. So it's quite a lot of wells we're talking about. Secondly, it's very important to understand that although flooding has been presented as an example of how egress of surface water or other contaminants might get in, we cannot predict every eventuality. That's the point. If we could, we would deal with it on a kind of, we could see exactly what was going to happen. The point about the drinking water standards is they're set up to protect from all eventualities. If you like, it's an all hazards approach. So I don't think it would be reliable to say, okay, we think maybe flooding is a risk. Indeed, it could be. What about other risks? What about leakages from sewage pipes that are unpredictable? So I don't think we're in a situation where we can just kind of guess what the hazard is going to be and try and respond to that. We have to have something that is going to fix the water, keep it safe for the period of time until we know that the system is sealed properly. Now, I think some people have raised the issue of, well, maybe UV treatment is an option, but actually from a financial perspective that is so expensive that that would be an inappropriate cost for what is in effect a short period of time. Yeah. So chlorination is technically, in my view, is the only technical approach, but John Mackey may have comments on whether there are alternatives, but as far as I can see, it's the only one we've got.
Yeah. And yes, Alice is quite right. And of course, with flood events, to have people standing at boreheads when most people are deployed looking at flooding homes and flooding streets, the type of resource we're talking about there is huge. UV, not practicable for a temporary solution. High investment, high capital, it needs building, it needs land, it needs mechanical equipment. So not able to be deployed quickly either, so that would take a longer time and a much higher cost.
Thank you, and that's good to hear, because I think that some of our communications have said that we're looking at all options, and non-chemical ones haven't been presented in this case. There's been some commentary in social media and in the general media about the delays. And I'm just wondering if, since we lost our secure status on the 22nd, whether you, Alistair, would have preferred us to have been chlorinating prior to now. So while we had the council break, staff have the delegation, should they choose to use it, to actually proactively chlorinate our city supply. And while there hasn't been an imminent risk, you're asking us to do it now. Yeah. Would you have preferred us to do it earlier as an organisation?
The work was already started between senior staff from Health and City Council as soon as they got the information on the 22nd. I suppose in the best of all possible worlds, what we're saying is things should happen as promptly as possible. I think it would still have required the council to come to a decision anyway. But my answer is yes, as soon as possible. But if the question then is, has there been an unnecessarily large risk presented to our community because of that delay? The answer is no, because nothing has changed. As we've said, it's the rigour of the application of the standards by the engineering company that's changed, and therefore the message is, let's get on with this, let's get it done as soon as possible so that we can lift chlorination as soon as possible.
So one of the concerns I have is with our engagement with the community. So there's been a decision taken that this should be a council decision rather than a staff one, and that presumably is for elected members, representatives of the community, to be able to take other things into account than maybe the technical detail that staff would use. And I'm just wondering, given that you don't have any great concerns about the delay so far, whether you would be concerned about a further delay should we choose to consult with the community over this. It seems that we have local government, once it gets to a council space, we have obligations under the Local Government Act with issues of high significance, which this is clearly, to consult with our communities. And being that there is no great urgency and there is no imminent risk, whether we should be consulting with the community over this.
Whether you consult with the community or not, you have an obligation to deliver a safe water supply. You now know that the engineers have told you that it is not completely safe. You can't unknow that. You have to, in my view, react promptly, and therefore I think it's good that the council are considering this. It's good that they're taking a decision, but I think they need to take a decision promptly with the best technical information that they have received from health and from their engineers. I don't think it is appropriate. This is not, in my view, because the conditions arise under the Health Act, it is not, in my view, an issue that should have delay built into it by a consultation process. I strongly agree that the public need to be clearly informed about your reasons for this, and my view, certainly over the last few days, is that we have a community who understand these things. There are some misunderstandings, as the Mayor has said, but by and large the questions I've received from the community, and I have received a few, have been sensible questions. People in Christchurch understand. I think most people understand the risks, and they also understand the processes that are being put in place to keep their water safe in the past, and so they should, because it's their money that's going into it. So I don't think it requires a consultation. I think it requires information, and I think it requires a prompt response.
Thanks. Was this the first year we've used this engineering company?
No.
It's the first time we've used this company for wellhead security assessments.
And why did we change?
Because we've now got a panel of consultants that we use for Three Waters work, and the previous consultant isn't on that panel, and so there was a panel member who had suitable experts, so we chose to procure it through the panel.
No, that's cool. The question I have around the wellheads is there any idea of how many wellheads we have that are at risk under the current circumstances that we're facing?
Yeah, well, that's covered in the report. There are 103, all at varying degrees of repairs required. And they're being triaged, so we're working on the most severe first, but the total is 103. So as we get through the program of work, the actual pace of those repairs should pick up because there isn't so much work involved.
Yeah, so what I'm thinking is do you think there would be a time where we go through the most critical ones to start with, and then we can go back to the drinking water assessor and say, we have done this amount, we've done those critical ones? Do you think, and then go back to the engineers and say, this is the work program we've done on these critical ones. Do you think we've got enough of those critical ones done to actually then be able to sign off on the drinking water standards as secure? then we can go back to the drinking water assessor and say that the engineers are signed off on those certain ones that were most at risk, and then we can get back, satisfy those conditions to unchlorinate if we do that.
Yes, and that's an option we are looking at. So we will progressively get that statutory assessment done as we complete the program, rather than wait until the end. And if it is able to be done on a zone-by-zone basis, we'll certainly endeavour to do that. So, but that will really depend on that agreement and alignment with the drinking water assessor, who has to sign off on the water safety plan.
But the engineers have to sign off on the secure status. And so obviously there may be some that are worse off than others, and we've seen that graph in the report. But do you have any indication of where we may get to in that point where the engineers may be able to say, okay, we're happy and satisfied that the worst ones are done, the ones that are still yet to be done under the work program are okay under the current drinking water standards, and that they will be happy to sign off the entire the work program that's been done in the entire city, so that we can go back and get unchlorinate the water if we're going down that track.
I'd be speculating, and I don't want to speak for the drinking water assessor, who would have to make that call. We've said December this year, but we will be using best efforts to bring that forward by utilising multiple crews where we don't need the specialist lining contractor. We can get other crews to go and do the other minor repairs, and then progressively get the sign-off by the independent engineers, and hopefully get to a point of agreement with the drinking water assessor where there is satisfaction that there are sufficient controls in place, sufficient security on the below-ground wellheads, in order to give us back that status, and we could then cease chlorination. But I can't speak for the drinking water assessor at this point.
Okay, and the other question that's related around this was, a lot of them, well, a number of the wellheads are leaning on towards what Councillor Templeton was saying, was around flooding. Now, if we could address those ones, and then with the other ones that have got lower risk, could we then get to a point in the city where we could turn off full-time chlorination, but then part-time, well, if there was a flooding event, that would maybe, sort of looking at some of the other wellheads, actually just turn it on in those times until we got to the end of that program.
It's not just flooding that could cause contamination, it could be just high groundwater levels, which you wouldn't even see. So you could have high groundwater causing contamination. So it's not something you can easily predict.
I think I made the point that there's an array of predictable problems which we are aware of. There's also the unpredictable problems. It's an all hazards approach, not let's try and pick off those that we think are going to cause us problems.
The other one, there was a lot of questions that I've been getting from people around, and there's two parts to this one, is the safety of chlorination in itself, from a health perspective and from an infrastructure perspective. Is there anything that we can say to actually allay those fears to people, or is there actually some real risk that is posed if we do go down chlorination?
There is no health risk from chlorination, quite the opposite. The whole point of chlorination is to reduce health risk. Chlorination has been used for more than 100 years worldwide. Chlorination takes place in most cities in New Zealand as we speak, and has done for quite some time. Christchurch is an unusual exception. There is a theoretical risk, which some people might be aware of what they call disinfection byproducts, where chlorine has been shown in some very old papers to have reacted with the biomass in pipes, and those byproducts can have a health effect. However, those papers are old, and the more recent papers have suggested that it is not chlorine, in fact, that is the risk there, but it's bromine byproducts, which we obviously are not putting into the system. In any case, disinfection byproducts are one of the many substances that are monitored as part of the drinking water standards, and therefore they are kept at a very, very safe level anyway, and we are alerted to them if they were to go up. Moreover, John Mackey has proposed air scouring of the pipes in order that the biomass is reduced, another way of absolutely minimising those disinfection byproducts. So the answer is no, there is not a health risk from chlorine. And I suppose, given that people are reading the newspapers today and have heard that chlorine has been used in Syria, they might have difficulty understanding the difference between using chlorine as a chemical weapon and using chlorine for the benefit of people. Obviously, chlorine, as it is used in drinking water, is kept to a very, very low level that just removes microbial contamination. And the skill of the engineers is ensuring that they put in as little as they need to just ensure that there's enough chlorine in there to do the job that it's required to do. And it doesn't have, at those levels, it comes nowhere near causing any health effects.
I've got one more if that's okay. And it was just on the finance, changing tune a little bit more on the finances and point 6.7. And it says additional, and this is to John, additional budget may be required for further improvements to the wellhead recommendation, the wellheads recommended in the latest wellhead security assessments. Can you just explain a little bit more just what that means and how much potentially more we might be liable for if we go down this program to get up to the drinking water standards as mentioned in there?
Yes, so that's the gap I think we talked about before between what the independent engineers assessed needed to be done as against the $840,000 in the program that CityCare had suggested. So we haven't got the final figures what that gap is, so there's still some discussion to be had with the drinking water assessor, the assessment engineers and our contractors as to what we agree is the extra would need to be done over and above the 840. I don't anticipate that's going to be significant, but we haven't got the number just yet. But we'd certainly be watching.
And so where will that budget specifically come from?
Well, we've been challenged, we've been tasked to find this within existing maintenance budget. So it may mean that other things of lesser importance would be deferred.
We've got that coming back via a report back through
okay. I mean,
Mike.
Through the drinking water assessor just to make sure that they're satisfied with what needs to be done. And it may well be that not all of the recommendations, sometimes engineering companies recommend engineering solutions that may not be absolutely required to meet certain standards. But that's all going to be worked out. Come back through Italy and Italy will report back here.
And that comes back to my initial point, was where do we get to the point where we may actually end up saying we've got enough of this done so we can actually turn the chlorination off, but obviously that'll come later.
We've got this, all the way through the recommendations. All the way through the recommendations, we're making it crystal clear that this is for a temporary period, that we want staff to be working hand in glove with the drinking water assessor to see if we can switch any of it back on without the chlorine, if we can, and so we're going through zone by zone. That's very challenging because, as you can see from the maps, the nature of the zones are, there's one large zone and some very small zones, and it may not be so straightforward, but we've challenged staff to do that at the same time that we've challenged them to find the budget from within their existing provisions.
And is it appropriate for it to go to ITI, or is it of significance to come straight to council?
No, it'll go through ITI, but it'll come back to council with a recommendation.
I'm just thinking because of the importance of this and the time frame that we're talking about. There is always a delay between it going to a committee and then straight.
We can always bring it forward. There are 3 council meetings a month.
That's right.
Yeah. So Anne, David, Tim.
Thank you, and thank you, Alistair, for your very clear and reassuring summary of the situation. A question for you: it's my understanding that you make the decision to lift the chlorination order, I guess it is. What do you need to be satisfied to do that? What do you need to know, and how will you know that it's time to lift the chlorination order?
Secure bore status is what we will look for. That has to come from the engineering, an independent engineering assessment.
And a second question for John and the staff. I think a lot of people are worried that we're heading down a slippery slope of permanent chlorination. And can you give us reassurances that that is not, in fact, going to happen? And how will we know that that's not going to happen?
That's not an assurance I can give, unfortunately, because the other thing that's in play here is what the government does with the 51 recommendations from the inquiry. The inquiry recommends to government that we mandate adequate treatment across all of New Zealand. While we might be able to engage in that debate by saying we could be a special case or a special exemption, that would be the path I think I'm hearing is the way that Christchurch might want to go. But we're powerless.
Will want to go. Yes.
So, but we don't know what the government's response to those recommendations will be yet. So that's the $64,000 question, I suppose.
Will they have to legislate?
They'd have to change the drinking water standards.
So they wouldn't require legislation?
Not necessarily.
Sorry?
It might come under regulations rather than a change in statute. But I don't know. It depends on.
I think it would be most unfortunate if the government didn't allow for public engagement in that conversation. But I've heard them talking about transparency, so maybe that would be included. Right, David, Tim and Aaron.
Thank you. We've had indicated that we've got 103 wells that need to be remedied, and obviously it's our objective to do that as quickly as possible. The 7 that have been remedied to date, what was the process to select those 7, and do they reflect wellheads that were at greater risk, or where are we going? And going forward with the repair program, are you identifying wellheads that pose a potential greater threat to do those first?
Yes, there was an assessment done on the criticality of the wellheads that were selected first. The ones in the main pumps, which is in Beckenham, they were subject to some of that severe flooding we had in July. So quite severe flooding of contaminated stormwater. That posed a great risk. And of course, the schedule was prepared in consultation with our own technical people and the drinking water assessor and the contractor. So they're done in the order of the most important.
So of the remaining 96 that we have to deal with, are there any that fall into the same level of severity that we have already dealt with? Or have we dealt with the absolute worst already? Or how many more at that high end of exposure to risk would we have to deal with?
Yeah, that's difficult to know in the detail. We've just named them in here. What they might entail I could come back to the ETI and say, well, this is the amount of work. And there is I think in one of the reports from City Care, there is a costing against each of the wellheads, and you could take by inference that the greater the cost, the more work that needs to be done. So that's on page 29 of the report.
So are we working through them in that order?
In the priority order.
Order of priority.
Yeah, correct.
Thank you.
Yep. Sorry, I'm just sidetracked. Tim, Aaron, Sarah.
Thank you. John, first question to you. I've only got 2 questions, so I won't take up too much time. First question is, we're in late January now. It's going to take 60 days to implement the chlorine if we go that way. So we're looking at, if we expedite the program, somewhere hopefully in October, but it may be December, but it could be longer. But so we're looking around 7 to 9 months, hopefully, that we would have to chlorinate, taking in the 60 days to set up, etc. With regards to that, could And I know, Alistair, you mentioned that we can't really rely on it being a flood event. That would be the contamination. It could be a blown sewer or something along those lines. But if we were to set up the chlorination, would it be possible to set that up to implement it? Because I'm not an engineer, I don't know how you do that, to implement in the event of something coming towards us, as in if we got a few days or a week of a storm event coming, could we do that rather than to implement it straight away within the following the 60 days? I'm just trying to see, are we able to cut down the time that we chlorinate if we go that way?
It would make a lot of sense to try and roll this out within the 2 months we talked about. In discussions with City Care at their response after the earthquakes, it was 6 to 8 weeks to deploy the chlorination, and I expect that would be the best way. And we'd start it all at once. Would by far and away be the best way of deploying the chlorine, which gives, during that 60 days, you could do quite a bit of mains cleaning as well to reduce the impact. So rather than staggering it, I would suggest that we do a mains cleaning program in parallel with the establishment of these 56 different locations that require skid-mounted chlorination equipment located at each one of those sites.
So with the chlorine, do you set it all up and then it starts to mix in, or I guess my question is, could you set it up to be able to implement immediately if there were an event happening, or an event?
The trouble is we don't know when that event might be. So groundwater intrusion, for example, there'd be no weather event associated with that perhaps. So, and I don't know that would meet the requirements that of the advice that we have.
With securing the bore heads, would that save from a contamination from a sewer leak?
Yes.
It would. Okay.
Through that mechanism.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. The second question is, I wouldn't want to weigh council staff down on a report or a review of where we've been and how we've got here until the concentration should be on expediting what we're doing and looking at that later on. But I think that following all this, to have a review or a post-event report on how we've got and what's happened would be really important too. But to the full council, because I've
got a recommendation that through the ITI committee, so it comes back to council through ITI, that they look at a review of the inspection regime for the monitoring assessment of below-ground wellheads undertaken prior to June 2017 and since, because I think what we need to understand as councillors, and that's why I don't just buy that it's the standards have changed. Yep. What were the previous standards good enough, and was the not the results of the inquiry, yep, but the events of August 2016, were they sufficient to be the wake-up call that actually the country needed?
I totally understand that, and I totally respect that the chair of the ITI committee coming back and reporting to full council, yeah, but this is of such significance to the city. I'm not a member of the ITI committee, I'm not a member of the
You can go to it though.
Oh yeah, I can, yeah, but I think that the review should come to full council.
It will.
But via ITI it should come. Why get council staff to do two things when they can just come back to full council?
Because they can come back through ITI. I mean, ITI might pick up some of the issues that they want further clarification on before it comes back to council. I mean, it is important to have the specialist committee that actually has the detailed knowledge and has the ongoing oversight responsibilities for this program of work. So, I mean, it's not unusual for it to go through a committee first, but the full yes, report will come to council. I
totally realise that and understand that, but yeah, I think this is of such significance that it should, but you know, that's a difference of opinion.
Yeah, but please do go, and every councillor can go to individual committee meetings, and I would encourage that perhaps when you get to that one, Pauline, it might be worthwhile holding it as a separate meeting and as a specific item of the agenda, the issues that are being considered here.
So I guess in that case, will non-members of the ITI committee get a chance to speak and be part of that discussion? Because I think we do that by invite of the chair, and I totally respect that as well. But again, I'm saying that this is such a significant issue.
Yeah, no.
But that's a question only the chair.
That's down to each chair. But generally speaking, people have the right to speak but not to vote. That's the only difference. Generally speaking. Yeah. It's such a significant issue, I think that should be discussed. I understand this completely.
The conference is about to end.
Jamie.
Well, no.
Jamie, the conference is about to end. You can dial back in.
Need to dial back in. All right, I will dial back in. Mustn't have paid my telecom bill.
No. Jamie?
Yes, I'll ring straight back.
You dial back in. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll dial straight back in.
Okay. I don't know. Have you emailed the resolutions to Jamie?
He could like screen. But surely he could look on his... so he can look at live screen on there.
Yeah. I think we're still working on another recommendation to go...
It's up there.
It's in there now. Right, okay. So we've got... I just think we should continue and get this done rather than break for morning tea. Do we have a legal requirement to break for a particular after?
I'm back, by the way.
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. Aaron, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I just have a couple of follow-ons, but I may have to depart the room because I've been consuming lots of water because it's not chlorinated yet. I'm going to preload just in case, depending on how the decision goes. And my body's never seen so much water. It's normally a different colour. Now, my two questions that have arisen through the question process is you mentioned Beckenham before, which posed one of the greatest risks. This one's been... especially around that flooding, when that flooding event happened, the last one, not just the one. But and was that then tested, and were there any transgressions when we had the flooding event at that wellhead, given it was one of the worst?
Yeah, there have been no transgressions at all. Yeah.
Right.
From those wells.
And that was just confirming one of the worst?
Correct.
And had flooding all around it?
Yeah.
Cool. That's a good start. And then the other one is, what assurances can we give the public that once the schedule of works, the accelerated schedule of works, is completed and these are been finished to the standard that you're expecting, what insurances can we give the public that the engineers and then the water assessor will sign off and say they are secure, we are happy, there will be no chlorine?
So the engineers have confirmed in writing that once we've implemented their recommendations, they will sign off the wells as secure.
Well, that's good. And then the other one is the water assessor himself. Do we have a word
as long
that
as
they'll be
the
happy?
groundwater is secure, they're then the supply would be compliant with the drinking water standards, so that would be signed off as well immediately.
Sarah, then Mike.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if we've had concerns over the previous monitoring, but there have been many comments by members of the public who want reassurance that the governance response has been appropriate, and I'm just wondering if part of the reporting that comes back should include that as well, with the delays and all sorts of things. There's been quite a lot of questions around that. Whenever we've had major things happen, the fire response, those kind of things, we've had some form of reporting, and I know that's been through the Civil Defence Act, but whether that should happen as well, to reassure people that the response has been appropriate.
Which recommendation is that? Can you go back up to 4?
So that report at the moment talks about the assessments, but not the other governance processes and reporting and all of those kind of structures that may have allowed earlier action, for example. No, because that deals with the technical, not the process. So it looks at the review of the inspection regime, the monitoring and assessment, but not that reporting structure for those types of things to council.
And I mean, just to say, that's similar to the question I had around the audit and risk.
Yep.
Finances performance, audit and risk committee.
Yeah.
And how do we get the best governance?
But in this instance, we've covered that by strengthening the reporting through to ITI, and I think ITI will be on top
a report so that we can learn from what has happened potentially in the way of reporting. So there were things that ITE didn't know, for example, through this process, and there have been questions about the delay in our response, and having a review just to look at that response.
There's an assumption that there's been a delay in the response from the council. This is the first council meeting of the year, so there hasn't been a delay in our response. You know, and so I just think that the last thing that I want to do is to take people's minds off the fact that we need to get this work done so that we can, if we implement temporary chlorination, that we can get it out of our water as quickly as possible. That's my priority. So,
and if we're able to reassure people that there hasn't been a delay, then that would be really good. But there have been questions, and it would be quite.
This is the first council meeting of the year. There is no delay. This is the first opportunity this council has had to react to it. The council staff have had delegation in this matter. They relinquished that this week. So this is the first time this council could deal with the matter. So I just kind of want to put that to bed. There is no delay that has caused any risk to our communities that is any greater than any risk that they've ever faced in relation to our water. So I just think that it's a side issue, but it is an issue that obviously councillors will want to raise at some stage in the reasonably near future, but not through a reporting mechanism to a committee. So, and that is something that we can address on a different occasion. So I've got Mike next.
Thank you. My questions were actually around what Tim was talking about the 60 days to implement the chlorination. After the earthquakes, how long did it take to actually, once that decision was made to chlorinate, how long did it take?
About 8 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks.
So you were sort of saying before that you're going to wait till everything's set up and then do all the chlorination at once. Is that sort of indicating really the risk isn't that high, that you're not putting in line as soon as you possibly can?
That is as soon as possible. We have to purchase the equipment and install it before we can start chlorinating.
From what I took from your last answer was you're actually going to set everything up. Instead of doing them, as soon as you get one online and start dosing it straight away, you'll wait till everything's ready to go and then dose it all at once.
I think that's the best advice, because if we start timing that over different parts of the city, that chlorine, because of the integrated network arrangement, we want to tell people a given date, this is the date, so they can plan for things. There are people who are going to have to make other provisions, people on dialysis, people with tropical fish, people who rely on unchlorinated water for their, might be food manufacturing. So we've got to be clear that we've got to give them a concise date, otherwise they could be leaching from one zone to another. So when someone gets chlorine when they didn't think they were going to, we don't want to have that situation.
So chlorinating the water is going to put another risk for some people?
It will. It's about information. It's about informing people. I mean, people on dialysis use chlorinated water all over the country. It just needs to be dechlorinated for that purpose. Same with tropical fish.
So we know at the moment that the risk hasn't changed. We're just obviously aware there's an issue, but there's no change to the risk. So technically what we could say is this is where the water's at. It's been the same as it always has been. If you're concerned, boil your water. And let people choose what they want to do to actually make their water sterile.
Can I make a comment about boil water notices?
It's the secure status.
Yeah. That is not an appropriate and responsible position for a supplier to take, to rely on a boil water notice. A boil water notice is an emergency provision that has limited value. It was remarkable that after the earthquake, the people of Christchurch continued to boil their water for up to, it was up to the point at which the water became chlorinated. And we knew that because we carried out telephone surveys. The reason it was remarkable is because all the evidence suggests from all over the world that boil water notices have little value after the first few days. People boil their water rigorously at first, then one day they don't do it, nothing happens, they feel they're okay, they then don't boil their water. Then the problem happens. So boil water notices are not the solution for long-term risk.
And so another question, so although our water's in zones, those zones aren't isolated, the network's integrated, isn't it? It all joins up.
Yeah, they can be operated in, in different configurations.
So if we did have an outbreak in one zone, could that be controlled to that one zone, or would it filter through to the whole of the network?
Normally, if there is any transgression, and as Alistair said, it's generally at reservoirs, we do chlorinate in that given zone, and we try and isolate as much as we can to stop the spread of any contamination beyond the immediate vicinity.
And that's the same within the actual city?
Yes, correct.
Just asking staff to put the zone picture up there, because I think people need to see the size of the zones that we're talking about when we quite rightly are trying to look to isolate zone by zone. But when you look at the central pressure zone, then it is most of Christchurch.
There was the ability to isolate patches of that. It's just that that whole zone now is connected. There is still a possibility.
Yeah, and we've asked staff to do that on a case-by-case basis where it can be done. But you've also said that there's a potential around leaching as well between zones.
Of water between zones.
So there was someone else, Glenn.
Yeah, thank you. Just one question on the regulatory time frame. Have you got any sense of, in terms of government, coming out of stage 2, when any regulation perhaps may be new government, early days? So, are you thinking maybe later in this calendar year? Or?
Yeah, well, certainly my advice from the inquiry is that they've prepared their report that's gone to the DG, it's gone to the Department of Internal Affairs as well, and to the ministers who call for it. And there is staff advice, or advisor advice being prepared for government to consider. And I believe all that advice will be in with government by June this year. So what happens after that, there'll be another process, there'll be the consideration around what the response is.
Right. I have no sense of how long things take through the House, but how soon after that is it a guess?
A regulatory matter would not go through Parliament. That's my concern. That's why I asked the question about whether it was statutory or regulatory.
Okay.
It's a question for the executive.
Perhaps I can just add one thing. The drinking water standards, there's a provision in the Health Act that says if they're going to amend the drinking water standards, there needs to be consultation for at least 3 years, unless before there's an amendment, unless they think it needs to be done. It's a matter of urgency, or it deals with a transitional or minor matter.
Right.
Just to check, because I don't know about central government, so the cabinet would make the decision. Yep. Okay.
Mm. So, any more, Yanni?
I just wanted to check on the repair program. I note that in the City Care report it says that the repair program would not address the sewage getting into the water system as the flooding in July last year. So in terms of the repair program, I just wanted to understand, are we looking, I know we want to get this done as soon as possible, I understand that, but for areas that are susceptible to flooding, in terms of raising the station out of ground like the Burnside Park one, are we looking at, or do we get a choice around the level of investment to secure the ones that, you know, we may consider that it's more beneficial long term? Who makes that call?
The recommendation is to repair the below ground wellheads. The program to bring them all above ground, we're better off to wait to end of useful life, because once they're repaired to a waterproof standard, one could argue that they're as good as an above ground wellhead as far as ingress of surface water is concerned. I mean, we're talking about some fairly high-tech sealants here that are quite effective. We can decide through the LTP process that the city wants to bring all of the wells, below ground wells, above ground, and that would be a consideration that the council would make at the LTP capital program review. So it is all possible, but these wells, below ground wells, they have an average life of 50 to 60 years, and you would be walking away from that investment if you did it early. So there's an economic argument here as well. Let's make the best use of the assets that we have, keep them in a good, tight operative condition, reduce the risk of ingress of surface water, and I think we then, when we replace those wells at the end of their useful life, we then replace that with an above ground structure.
But sorry, just a quote from the City Care report. The residual risks which will remain following completion of the repair works include chamber inundation through higher than designed rainfall events, river waterway flooding. So what I can't understand is, given that, and we also told that in the July event that we got the river water inundated a number of wellheads, contaminated them with sewage wastewater, which had been washed in via surcharge sewage networks pump stations. So why wouldn't we raise those ones at least above ground?
There's two things here. There's raising the chambers rather than the actual wellhead. Raising the wellhead above ground means a new bore, which is, it don't matter altogether. So it's just about putting extra risers on the chamber so that it's above a given flood level. And we're doing that citywide flood modelling to determine what those flood levels are.
So the ones that got raw sewage in them in July last year, the repair program that we're being asked to approve is going to stop sewage getting into them?
Absolutely going to reduce the risk of that contamination occurring, absolutely.
What do we need to actually stop it from happening?
Oh, it's all about investment.
So, but the City Care report says that if we go with the repair that they're proposing, it won't stop that from happening.
In extreme events.
Well, we've heard over and over that the flooding along the Heathcote River, for example, is no longer considered extreme, that it happens on a regular basis. So, I mean, I just worry that there may be cases where we actually want additional investment, and I know it will cost more, but to actually address that, what does seem a very real risk that we've actually, I know it may not be recorded as a transgression, but I would have thought from a health point of view, it's a pretty significant risk that is very real to people.
Yeah, so these things can be waterproofed entirely, and that's something we can come back at with the normal, regular monthly ET reports to give you progress on those and give you that assurance that method of contamination won't occur on these improved wellheads.
Can I just ask the medical officer of health, in those July flood events, there was no boil water notice issued?
No, there were no transgressions either.
And so even though the sewage got into the water supply, it was...
No, water sewage did not get into the water supply.
Be very careful about what you say, because when you make statements that are utterly inaccurate and then create an impression that something happened that didn't happen, that becomes the issue. That is not what happened. There were no transgressions.
Sorry, I'll quote the thing so it's totally accurate. During the rainfall event of 20 to 22nd July, river water inundated a number of wellheads, contaminating them with sewage wastewater, which had been washed in via surcharge sewage network pump stations. So it didn't go into the water supply. So So the issue was that it got into the wellhead, but it didn't get into the water system.
Just heard staff saying that it was the chamber, it did not get into the water supply.
Right.
And the mitigation for that, should anything get in there, that now has sump pumps that pump it straight out again, and secondly, it has an alarm that goes to a SCADA system, and there's people on standby who get that alarm immediately with a 60-minute response time. So those mitigations are there what provides the confidence that that is not a risk.
So we would know, would we know within 24 hours whether it had been contaminated?
We'd know within an hour.
Right.
Because the sump pump's going to do its job, and the wet floor alarm is going to trigger. And so while the sump pumps start off, the person on call has got the alarm in order then to go out and deploy.
So just understanding in terms of a risk point of view, if we know within an hour, what's to stop us from then going and chlorinating given that we know something's happened? Versus what we're being told now is that we should just chlorinate across the network.
That's one mechanism though, Councillor. There's other mechanisms that we might not be as obvious as a July storm event.
Possible to have a 2-minute break before debate, please? Because I don't want to miss any of the debate and I need to leave the room.
Sorry, I didn't turn my microphone on. Jamie, have you got any questions? I'd just like to come to you now.
Thanks. I think a lot of it's been answered, and I actually heard Taylor Naviani's questioning, and it may have been along the same lines. Tim started it, but so apologies if this has been covered, but it's really just around the rollout versus deployment. So I just want to be clear on that. Is it 60 days to build and put in place the temporary infrastructure to chlorinate the water supply, and then another 6 to 8 weeks to deploy the chlorine into the supply? Or can the chlorination be deployed reasonably rapidly? I heard the tail end of what it sounded like a matter of hours. Is that the case?
Okay, so the 60 days is the entire deployment. So from the decision, in 60 days' time, we could have chlorination active in the city.
But then it's chlorinated immediately once the 60 days is up. But I think you might have missed the questioning, Jamie, that said that the reason for choosing the 1 day for implementing it was so that people who need to dechlorinate, like people who are using dialysis or filling a tropical fish tank or producing beer or something, they need to be able to dechlorinate. They need to know what date it's going to apply from, rather than just a rollout across the city. They need a date.
Yeah, no, that is helpful, and I guess this then really comes down to an appetite for risk, and from a medical standpoint, that may be an unacceptable risk, but it follows on, I guess, with what Tim was questioning, was would the medical officer of health be comfortable with us putting in place the infrastructure, and then in the event that there was heavy rainfall or was something that we think would heighten the risk to contamination of the water supply, to then deploy chlorination, or is there just too many variables there and too big a risk to take with that?
The answer is there's just too many variables and too big a risk to take with that.
No, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Well, look, we'll just adjourn for 5 minutes. 4 minutes. We'll come back at 11:35. Thank you.